April 4th, 1991. Warner Brothers Studios, Burbank, California. To most people working on the lot, it seemed like an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Stage 16 buzzed with activity. Crew members adjusted lighting rigs. Production assistants hurried between departments. Cables stretched across the floor. The smell of coffee drifted from the craft services table near the back of the soundstage. Another day in Hollywood. Another day making movies. At the center of it all stood Steven Seagal. At 38 years old, he looked exactly like the image Hollywood had spent the last 3 years building. Tall, broad-shouldered, confident, almost intimidating. At 6'4" and over 200 pounds, he dominated nearly every room he entered, and lately he had become accustomed to people treating him like the most important man in those rooms. Success had arrived quickly, perhaps too quickly. Only 3 years earlier, most Americans had never heard his name. Then came Above the Law. The film surprised Hollywood. Audiences responded. Studios noticed. Money followed. Then came Hard to Kill, then Marked for Death. Each success seemed larger than the last. Now, Out for Justice was already deep into production. Warner Brothers believed they had discovered their next major action star, and Steven Seagal believed it too. Standing beneath the stage lights that afternoon, few people would have argued with him. The cameras loved him, the studio loved him, the box office loved him. Every sign pointed upward. Yet hidden beneath the success was something much less visible. A wound. A small one, but persistent. The kind of wound pride never allows a man to forget. The previous year, martial arts fans across America had voted in Black Belt magazine's annual poll, Action Star of the Year. The winner had not been Steven Seagal. The winner had been Chuck Norris. Again. And somehow, that bothered him far more than he admitted. He never spoke about it publicly, never complained, never argued. But people who knew him well understood something. Steven Seagal didn't like being second at anything, especially not in martial arts, especially not to Chuck Norris. Across the Warner Brothers lot that same afternoon sat Chuck Norris himself, completely unaware that he was occupying so much space inside another man's thoughts. Chuck was 49 years old, older, smaller, and considerably less interested in proving anything. He sat near craft services with a cup of coffee. Across from him sat an old friend, Gene LaBelle, one of the toughest men in the stunt business. The two men had known each other for decades. They had trained together, worked together, traveled together, seen enough fights to last several lifetimes. Now they simply sat and talked. Nothing dramatic, nothing important, just two old martial artists enjoying a quiet afternoon. The contrast between them and Steven Seagal could not have been greater. One side of the soundstage buzzed with ambition. The other sat peacefully drinking coffee. Fate, however, had plans for both. Back on set, the director called, "Cut!" The scene was finished. For now. Steven stepped away from the camera. A production assistant handed him a towel. He wiped sweat from his face, then turned toward craft services. He wanted coffee, nothing more. At least, that's what he thought. Then he saw Chuck Norris. Immediately something changed. Several crew members would later describe the moment the same way. They watched Steven stop walking. Just briefly, a few seconds, but long enough to notice. His expression shifted. The muscles around his eyes tightened. His smile disappeared, and for a moment he looked like a man remembering something unpleasant. Then he started moving again. Except now the casual walk was gone. Every step seemed deliberate, purposeful. The walk of someone who had just made a decision. Nobody knew what decision. Not yet. But everyone would soon find out. Stephen walked directly toward the folding table, past crew members, past lighting equipment, past stacks of props, straight toward Chuck Norris. People began noticing, at first only a few, then more, then nearly everyone nearby. Because when one famous martial artist walks directly toward another famous martial artist, people pay attention, especially in Hollywood, especially on a stunt-heavy action movie set. Gene LaBelle noticed first. He saw Stephen approaching. He said nothing, simply watched. Chuck looked up as Stephen arrived. The two men exchanged greetings, polite, professional, friendly enough. At first, Stephen made a brief comment about one of Chuck's recent films. Nothing offensive, nothing unusual, the kind of conversation people have every day. Chuck nodded politely. The conversation could have ended there. Probably should have ended there. Instead, it continued. And with every sentence, the atmosphere changed. Slowly, almost invisibly. Stephen began discussing martial arts, then styles, then systems, then effectiveness. The stunt crew nearby started listening, without meaning to. They simply couldn't help it. Martial artists always notice when other martial artists start debating, especially famous ones. Soon, 12 different people were paying attention. Not openly, not obviously, but listening. Stephen spoke confidently, very confidently. He explained why Aikido represented the future, why older systems had become outdated, why traditional approaches no longer worked. Chuck listened quietly, occasionally nodding, occasionally sipping coffee, never interrupting, never arguing. That seemed to frustrate Stephen, because people looking for confrontation often become irritated when they find calmness instead. So he pushed further, and further, and further, until finally he said the thing he had actually walked over to say, the thing he had probably wanted to say for a very long time. He looked directly at Chuck Norris and smiled. "Your karate is useless, Chuck." The words landed heavily, much heavier than Stephen expected. The entire area became quiet, not silent, but close. Gene LaBelle slowly lowered his coffee cup. Several stunt performers exchanged glances. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Everybody waited, because now they understood. This wasn't a conversation anymore. This was a challenge. And the next 60 seconds would become one of the most talked-about stories in Hollywood stunt history. For several seconds after Steven Seagal's words left his mouth, nobody moved, nobody laughed, nobody reacted. The entire atmosphere on stage 16 seemed to freeze. Even the sounds of the film set felt quieter. The lighting crew stopped adjusting equipment. The boom operator lowered his microphone slightly. A production assistant carrying paperwork slowed to a stop. Everyone understood something important. A line had just been crossed. Steven Seagal stood beside the folding table with complete confidence. His smile remained. The smile of a man who believed he already knew how the story would end. Across from him, Chuck Norris remained seated, calm, relaxed, unbothered. That calmness confused some people, because most men would have reacted. Most men would have defended themselves. Most men would have answered immediately. Chuck didn't. He simply looked up at Stephen, studied him, measured him, then took another sip of coffee. The silence lasted longer than anyone expected. For a brief moment, Some crew members wondered if Chuck would simply ignore the insult, walk away, refuse to engage. After all, he didn't have anything to prove, not anymore. His reputation had been built decades earlier, long before Hollywood, long before movie sets, long before cameras. Chuck Norris had already been fighting when Steven Seagal was still learning his first techniques. He had won championships, defended titles, trained with masters, faced pressure few people could imagine. At 49 years old, he had already survived every kind of challenge a martial artist could face. Which was exactly why he wasn't in a hurry. Finally, Chuck placed his coffee cup down. Carefully. Quietly. Then he looked directly at Steven. His voice was calm, almost friendly. "I'd be happy to discuss martial arts." The tension eased slightly. Then Chuck continued, "But discussions like that are usually better standing up." The room became silent again. Everyone understood what he meant. Steven understood too. The smile on his face widened. This was exactly what he wanted. Exactly what he had hoped for. He gestured toward the open section of the soundstage between several lighting rigs. "Of course." Chuck stood, slowly, without drama, without emotion, without any sign of irritation. He removed his denim jacket, folded it once, placed it neatly over the back of his chair. Nothing about the movement seemed theatrical. It felt routine, almost ordinary, the way a man prepares for something he has done countless times before. Underneath, he wore a simple white, short-sleeved shirt, tan slacks, brown boots, nothing resembling fighting gear, nothing resembling preparation. Yet somehow the sight made several stunt professionals nervous. Because real fighters rarely look the way movies expect them to look. Steven Seagal removed his leather jacket, tossed it onto a nearby chair, then rolled the sleeves of his dress shirt up to his elbows. The gesture looked impressive, purposeful, confident. His size immediately became obvious. Standing across from Chuck, he looked enormous, taller, heavier, younger, stronger, at least physically. Several crew members exchanged worried glances. A few quietly assumed Chuck might be in trouble. The size difference was impossible to ignore. But Jean LaBelle wasn't worried, not even slightly. He sat back in his chair, picked up his coffee, and watched, the way a man watches a movie he's already seen. Around them, 12 people naturally formed a loose circle. Nobody instructed them to, nobody organized it. It simply happened. Human nature. People wanted a better view. The boom operator lowered his pole completely. A lighting technician stepped away from a stand. The craft services attendant froze with a coffee pot in his hand. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Chuck walked into the center of the open space. His hands relaxed at his sides. No stance, no pose, no display. He simply stood there. Steven noticed and interpreted it as confidence, or perhaps disrespect. Either way, he didn't like it. He took his own position, weight balanced, hands open, ready. The familiar Aikido posture he had practiced thousands of times. Everything looked exactly the way he expected. Everything felt familiar, comfortable, predictable. That confidence would soon become a problem. Because there was one thing Steven Seagal hadn't noticed. Something the older stunt professionals noticed immediately. Chuck Norris wasn't standing still. Not really. His eyes were moving constantly, watching, measuring, calculating, the way experienced fighters always do, seeing angles, distances, timing, things invisible to everyone else, things that would decide everything. The circle around them became perfectly quiet. Chuck looked at Steven. Stephen looked at Chuck. Nobody spoke. Then Stephen moved first, just as everyone expected. He stepped forward, fast, confident, direct. His left hand reached for Chuck's lapel. The opening motion of countless Aikido entries. Simple, effective, familiar. A movement he had repeated thousands upon thousands of times. Control the lapel, control the body, control the fight. Except this time, something strange happened. His hand found nothing, absolutely nothing. Chuck wasn't there anymore, not entirely, only a slight pivot, 45 degrees, barely noticeable, no dramatic movement, no visible effort. Yet somehow the target had vanished. Stephen's hand closed around empty air. Several senior stuntmen immediately exchanged looks. They understood exactly what had happened. The younger crew members didn't. Not yet. To them, it looked like nothing. To experienced fighters, it meant everything. Stephen reset immediately, trying not to show surprise, trying not to show frustration. But internally, something had already changed. The first technique should have worked, at least partially. It hadn't. Chuck remained relaxed, standing just outside range, watching, waiting. Stephen tried again. This time with both hands, a wider entry, more aggressive, more committed. Again he moved quickly. Again he reached. Again he found nothing. Chuck slid backward. Only inches. Barely enough to notice. Yet enough. Always enough. The distance remained frustratingly perfect. One half step beyond Stephen's reach, exactly where Chuck wanted it. Exactly where Aikido became difficult. Exactly where karate became dangerous. The stunt professionals noticed immediately. Gene LaBelle noticed too, and for the first time all afternoon, a small smile appeared on his face, because he already knew what Steven Seagal was beginning to discover. The fight wasn't happening where Stephen wanted it. The fight was happening where Chuck Norris wanted it. And that difference was about to become impossible to ignore. For the first time since walking across stage 16, Steven Seagal felt something he hadn't expected. Confusion. Not fear, not yet, just confusion. His first entry had failed. His second entry had failed. And the man standing across from him didn't seem remotely concerned. Chuck Norris remained relaxed, hands loose, breathing steady, eyes calm. Nothing about him suggested effort. Nothing suggested urgency. It was as though he were watching a demonstration rather than participating in one. That realization irritated Stephen, because fighters are accustomed to patterns. Years of training create expectations. Certain movements produce certain reactions. Certain techniques create certain opportunities. A lifetime of practice teaches the body what should happen next. The problem was that nothing was happening the way Stephen expected. Chuck wasn't reacting properly. Or perhaps more accurately, Chuck was reacting perfectly. Stephen simply hadn't anticipated it. The circle of crew members remained silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Nobody wanted to blink. Something important was unfolding, something educational, something most people only saw once in a lifetime. Stephen adjusted his stance. This time he moved more aggressively, faster, sharper, more committed. His hands shot forward again, looking for control, looking for contact, looking for anything he could build a technique around. Again, Chuck moved. Barely. A small shift, 6 inches, maybe less. Yet somehow it was enough. Always enough. Stephen's hands closed on empty air. Again. The frustration became visible. Not dramatic, not obvious, but experienced eyes could see it. Gene LaBelle certainly could. So could the senior stunt performers. They had watched real fighters for decades. They knew exactly what frustration looked like, especially when it appeared in someone who wasn't used to being frustrated. One of the stunt coordinators later described the moment perfectly. Steven wasn't fighting Chuck anymore. He was fighting the distance, and he was losing. Chuck remained exactly one half step beyond reach. A frustrating space, a dangerous space, the space where one fighter can touch you, but you can't touch him. That was where Chuck lived. That was where champions lived. Finally, Steven changed tactics. If careful entries weren't working, if technical setups weren't working, then maybe pressure would. He surged forward, both hands sweeping outward, attempting to trap, control, close the gap, force the exchange. The move came fast, faster than most people realized. But Chuck was already gone. He drifted backward, then sideways. At the same moment, his lead foot snapped forward. A short side kick, quick, controlled, precise. The strike landed against Steven's lead thigh. Not hard, not enough to injure, not enough to leave damage. Just enough. The sound echoed softly across the stage. Tap. The kick immediately withdrew. Several crew members looked confused. The strike seemed insignificant. Gene LaBelle smiled because he understood exactly what it meant. The kick carried a message, a very specific message. The message wasn't, "I can hurt you." The message was, "I can touch you whenever I want." There is a huge difference. Steven felt it too, not physically, mentally. The realization bothered him because, for the first time that afternoon, he understood something. Chuck wasn't avoiding him because he had to. Chuck was avoiding him because he wanted to. That distinction changed everything. The confidence Steven carried into the encounter began cracking, slowly, almost invisibly. But it was happening. The crew could feel it. The atmosphere had shifted. Earlier, everyone wondered what Chuck Norris would do. Now they wondered what Steven Seagal would do. That difference mattered. A lot. Steven reset once more. His breathing slightly heavier now, his movements less fluid. The calm certainty he carried at the beginning was fading. Meanwhile, Chuck looked exactly the same. Unchanged, relaxed, patient, watching, waiting. The difference between experience and confidence was becoming visible. One is earned, the other is borrowed. When pressure arrives, only one remains. Steven suddenly made a decision. No more setups, no more entries, no more patience. He would force the issue. He dropped his weight, lowered his center of gravity, and exploded forward. The movement surprised several crew members. It looked more like a wrestling entry than traditional Aikido, a desperate attempt to close distance at all costs. Because Steven finally understood the real problem. If he couldn't close the gap, nothing else mattered. For a brief moment, it almost worked. Almost. But champions live in the space between almost and success. Chuck saw the movement before it fully began. Years of fighting had trained his instincts. He recognized commitment immediately, recognized desperation, recognized momentum, and most importantly, recognized opportunity. Everything slowed. At least it felt that way to the people watching. Chuck planted his right foot, his hips rotated, his shoulders turned. And suddenly, one of the most famous techniques in martial arts history came to life. The reverse roundhouse kick, fast, clean, effortless. The movement seemed impossible. One moment, Chuck stood in front of Steven. The next moment, his heel was traveling through the air, a perfect arc, invisible to most eyes, beautiful in its precision, terrifying in its accuracy. Several stunt performers later admitted they barely saw it happen. They only saw the ending. The heel stopped, 1 inch from Steven Seagal's temple. 1 inch. No contact, no impact, no violence. Just truth, frozen in space. The entire soundstage went silent. Not normal silence, shock, pure shock, because everyone understood what they were seeing. The kick wasn't late. It wasn't wild. It wasn't accidental. Chuck Norris had complete control, complete accuracy, complete confidence. The kick had gone exactly where he intended and stopped exactly where he intended. 1 inch closer, and the afternoon would have ended very differently. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved, nobody breathed, nobody spoke. Steven stared at the heel suspended near his head. The reality settled in all at once. The distance, the timing, the speed, the control. Everything became impossible to deny. Chuck slowly lowered his foot, calmly, effortlessly, then stepped backward, 2 paces, hands returning to his sides, as if nothing unusual had happened. The entire exchange had lasted less than a minute, less than 60 seconds. Yet every person on stage 16 knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Not because of the kick, because of what the kick represented. A lesson, a warning, a correction. And now every eye turned toward Steven Seagal, waiting to see what he would do next. Stage 16 remained silent. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody laughed. Nobody even shifted their weight. The heel of Chuck Norris's reverse roundhouse kick had stopped 1 inch from Steven Seagal's temple. 1 inch. That distance might as well have been a mile, because every person standing on that soundstage understood exactly what it meant. The message required no explanation. Chuck Norris had controlled the entire exchange. The distance, the timing, the pace, the outcome, everything. And he had done it without touching Steven. For several seconds, Steven stood motionless. His hands remained slightly raised, his breathing heavier than before, his eyes fixed on Chuck, trying to process what had just happened, trying to find an explanation, trying to find a reason. Because pride rarely accepts reality immediately. It searches for alternatives first. Excuses, conditions, circumstances, anything except the truth. Across the cleared space, Chuck stood quietly, hands at his sides. No celebration, no smile, no victory pose, nothing. The lack of arrogance somehow made the lesson even more powerful. Jean LaBelle watched from the folding table, coffee cup in hand. His eyes moved from Chuck to Steven, then back again. He understood exactly what had happened, and, more importantly, he understood exactly what should happen next. The correct response was simple. Admit it, learn from it, shake hands, move forward. That was what experienced martial artists did. That was how growth happened. Unfortunately, growth requires humility. And humility was exactly what Steven Seagal struggled with most. Finally, Steven started walking, 3 slow steps, then another, moving toward Chuck. The crew watched carefully. Several people expected a handshake. Others expected an apology. Some hoped for both. Chuck remained where he was, waiting, patient, giving Steven every opportunity to choose the right path. Later, several stunt performers would describe the moment the same way. A fork in the road. 2 possible paths. One path led toward humility, the other toward ego. One path was difficult, the other was easy. Steven arrived at the fork, then chose. Unfortunately, He chose the easier path. Stopping a few feet from Chuck, he began talking. Not about the kick, not about the distance, not about what everyone had just witnessed. Instead, he mentioned the lighting, then fatigue, then timing, then luck. One explanation after another, each sentence moving farther away from the truth. The crew listened quietly. Nobody interrupted, nobody argued, but everyone understood. Stephen wasn't admitting what happened, he was explaining it away. The opportunity had arrived and passed. Chuck listened without responding. No argument, no debate, no need. Because some lessons speak for themselves. When Stephen finished, Chuck simply nodded. Once. The nod of a man who realizes there is nothing more to say. Then he turned around, walked back to the folding table, picked up his denim jacket, put it on. Jean LaBelle stood. The two old friends shook hands. Chuck quietly mentioned calling him over the weekend. Jean nodded. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical. Then Chuck walked toward the loading dock door. The stunt team naturally stepped aside. Not because anyone told them to, because respect creates space. Several crew members reached out as he passed, a hand on the shoulder, a brief touch on the arm. Small gestures, the kind men make when they have just witnessed something extraordinary. Chuck acknowledged each one with a nod. Then he disappeared through the loading dock door. The bright California sunlight swallowed him. The door closed, and Stage 16 slowly returned to work. At least on the surface. Inside people's minds, however, something different was happening. Nobody forgot. Not one person. That night they told the story, to friends, to family, to other stunt performers. The story traveled through Hollywood, quietly, the way real stories travel, person to person, voice to voice, because people recognized authenticity when they saw it. 3 weeks passed. Most assumed the lesson was over. Most assumed Stephen had reflected on what happened. Most assumed he had learned something. Jean LaBelle wasn't so sure. Then came another afternoon on Stage 16, another conversation near craft services, another audience, and another claim. Stephen stood talking with several stunt performers. The discussion had turned toward chokes, submission holds, real fighting. At first the conversation seemed harmless. Then Stephen made a statement, a very confident statement. He claimed nobody could choke him unconscious. Nobody, not under any circumstances. His Aikido training made him immune. The stunt performers exchanged glances. Several tried not to smile. Others looked uncomfortable, because they had heard similar certainty before. 3 weeks earlier. Jean LaBelle heard it too, and immediately remembered something. The kick, the silence, the excuses, the fork in the road. Most importantly, the choice Stephen had made. Jean took a slow sip of coffee, then casually offered to demonstrate. The offer sounded innocent, friendly, harmless. Anyone who knew Jean LaBelle understood better. The man was a legend, a judo champion, a professional wrestler, one of the toughest stunt performers alive. More importantly, he had very little patience for arrogance. Stephen accepted, confidently, just as he had accepted Chuck Norris's challenge. Several stunt performers immediately stopped what they were doing. A familiar feeling spread through the room. Not excitement, anticipation. They sensed history repeating itself, only this time the lesson would be different, because Chuck Norris had delivered a warning. Jean LaBelle intended to deliver a consequence. The demonstration began. What happened next would eventually become one of the most famous stories in martial arts history. Within moments, Jean secured the choke. Within moments more, Steven Seagal lost consciousness. The stunt team watched in stunned silence. Some versions of the story grew larger over time. Some details changed. Stories always evolve. But one fact remained consistent. Jean LaBelle had proven the point. The lesson Chuck Norris offered gently. Jean LaBelle delivered directly. Years later, people would remember the choke. Martial arts fans would debate it endlessly. Books would mention it. Podcasts would discuss it. Fighters would reference it. But those who were actually there remembered something else. The kick, the warning, the opportunity. Because the most important lesson happened before the choke, before the demonstration, before the embarrassment. It happened the moment Chuck Norris stopped a kick 1 inch short of Steven Seagal's temple. That was the moment everything could have changed. That was the moment humility could have entered the story. Instead, pride remained. And pride always charges interest. Eventually, everyone pays. Looking back, the story was never really about Chuck Norris, or Steven Seagal, or Jean LaBelle. It was about something much older. A lesson every martial artist eventually learns. A lesson every successful person eventually faces. Skill can make you dangerous. Success can make you famous. Power can make people notice you. But only humility allows you to keep learning. And the moment a man believes he has nothing left to learn, life usually sends someone to educate him. On a quiet afternoon in April 1991, inside Stage 16 at Warner Brothers Studios, that educator happened to be Chuck Norris. And when the first lesson failed, Jean LaBelle arrived to teach the second.